1824 Mississippi. The night was smothered in silence, the kind of silence that feels alive, as if holding its breath for something unspeakable. Beneath the weight of the humid air, the plantation house stood in cold defiance against the darkness, its windows glimmering faintly with candlelight. It was there, in that grand yet decaying home, that a widow was found lifeless at the stroke of midnight. Her eyes, wide and glassy, stared into nothingness, while her lips seemed frozen in the shape of a final word she never managed to release. To some, her face bore the stillness of peace. To others, it carried the terror of someone who had seen something no living soul should ever witness. The widow's life had always been a paradox. To the church and neighboring gentry, she was a woman of piety and charity, a grieving figure who had endured tragedy with dignity. They spoke of her donations to the parish, her care for orphaned children, her gentle words in public. Yet whispers told another story, one less suited to sermons and polite conversation. Workers on her land described her as cruel, her temper like the sudden storms that swept through the Mississippi Delta. They claimed her kindness was nothing more than a mask, that her generosity was offered only to those whose approval she needed, never to those beneath her. The plantation itself seemed to echo this contradiction. By day, it was a symbol of wealth and status, its columns gleaming white against the sun, its fields stretching endlessly into fertile soil. By night, it became something else entirely. Neighbors spoke of strange sounds drifting across the fields, unearthly cries, whispered prayers, the tolling of a bell that did not exist. The widow was said to wander her halls long after midnight, speaking to voices no one else could hear, clutching a rosary in one hand and a candle in the other. Was it grief that had unmoored her mind, or had she truly invited something darker into her home? Her death only deepened the mystery. The official record listed sudden illness as the cause, yet those who found her insisted no natural explanation could account for the way her body was discovered. There was no struggle, no wound, no sign of poison, only the uncanny serenity of her posture and the haunting gaze of eyes that refused to close. Some said she had been cursed, others swore the devil himself had come to claim her. A few believed she had simply chosen to surrender to her despair, her body collapsing under the weight of loneliness. But the more one studies the widow's story, the less certain the truth becomes. Facts dissolve into rumor, rumor blurs into legend, and legend settles into the soil like an unhealed wound. Her death was not merely the end of a woman's life. It was the beginning of a riddle that Mississippi has never fully answered. Perhaps she was innocent, perhaps guilty, perhaps neither. Yet even now, the midnight silence of the South carries her name like a warning, reminding us that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only endured. The story of the widow begins not with her death, but with the long shadow of her life. In the heart of Mississippi, her name carried weight, both revered and feared, echoing across the fields of her plantation and the narrow wooden pews of the local church. To the polite society of the South, she was a symbol of endurance, a woman who had suffered tragedy, losing her husband in his prime, yet who continued to manage vast lands, wealth, and reputation with apparent grace. They admired the way she wore black silk dresses for years after his passing, the way she attended every Sunday service, always seated near the front, rosary beads slipping through her fingers in quiet devotion. She was spoken of in sermons as a paragon of piety and perseverance, a living lesson in the dignity of widowhood. But outside the polished wood of the church and the drawing rooms of wealthy neighbors, another story circulated, one whispered by workers in the fields, whispered in kitchens lit only by embers, whispered by those whose lives unfolded in the shadows of her estate. To them, she was less a figure of pity than of dread. They claimed she paced her halls at midnight, whispering prayers that did not sound like prayers at all, words that rose and fell like incantations meant not for God, but for something darker. They said she punished small disobediences with cold precision, that she could smile at the altar on Sunday and order brutal discipline on Monday. The contrast was impossible to ignore. How could one woman be both the grieving saint and the silent tyrant? This paradox became the very fabric of her reputation, stitched together by rumor, religion, and fear. In her dual image, angel to some, tormentor to others, she seemed to embody the contradictions of an era built on fragile civility and hidden cruelty. Her early years were marked by tragedy, though even these events were filtered through the lens of superstition. She was born into privilege, the daughter of a family that owned fertile acres along the Mississippi Delta. From childhood, she was surrounded by whispers of omens. It was said that on the night of her birth the family dog howled without pause until dawn, and a candle in the family chapel flickered violently before extinguishing itself. To the church, these were simply accidents, coincidences. To others, they were portents, signs that the child carried something uncanny into the world with her first breath. Her marriage seemed to promise stability. She was young, beautiful, and ambitious. He was older, wealthy, and commanding. Their union expanded the reach of their estates, binding two powerful families in a knot of land and legacy. For years, their household seemed enviable. Balls were hosted, carriages lined the drive, music spilled into summer nights. Yet behind the grandeur, her husband's health began to falter. Letters preserved from that period describe his declining vigor, fainting spells, chest pains, sudden fits of silence that could stretch for hours. One physician suggested it was the swamp fever that claimed so many in the region. Others whispered it was her, that she had hastened his decline through powders mixed into wine, or through the strange late-night rituals she began to perform as his body weakened. When he died, the widow emerged at the center of both sympathy and suspicion. Neighbors carried casseroles and condolences, remarking on her composure, her steadfast mourning. But workers on the plantation told a different tale, that on the very night of his passing, she walked barefoot through the fields with a candle, whispering to the soil as if feeding secrets into the earth. Some swore she was seen kneeling before the family crypt, her hands raised not in prayer but in command. Psychologists today might frame her actions differently. Grief can carve hollows in the human mind, leaving people desperate for control. Loneliness corrodes reason. Rituals, even strange ones, can become coping mechanisms, small acts of order in a world collapsed by loss. In this light, her midnight wanderings might not have been sinister but therapeutic, a mind searching for rhythm in chaos. Yet this explanation collides with the fear etched in testimonies from those who lived closest to her. To them, her rituals were not healing but haunting, their rhythms carrying menace rather than comfort. Her public devotion to faith only deepened the contradictions. Each Sunday she dressed meticulously in black lace, her rosary beads gleaming, her voice soft but unwavering in hymns. Priests praised her contributions to the church, a new altar cloth, generous donations for repairs, food for the parish poor. And yet privately, even clergy confessed unease. One journal, left by a traveling minister, described how he had been invited to dine at her table. He recalled the way her eyes lingered too long on his crucifix, the way her questions about death were probing, almost hungry. He wrote that her prayers at the table were eloquent but unsettling, her voice lowering at the mention of salvation as though savoring each syllable. It was during these years of widowhood that the plantation itself seemed to transform into a theater of dread. Workers spoke of punishments meted out with icy calculation, of tasks extended late into the night, of whispers in languages they did not understand echoing through the halls. One tale describes her entering the quarters unannounced, holding a candle that flickered blue rather than yellow. Another tells of her dismissing a sick child with the words, "Pain sharpens the spirit." Whether these stories were embroidered with fear or anchored in truth is impossible to determine, yet their persistence suggests they reflected more than mere invention. Isolation only sharpened her legend. Without her husband, without children to anchor her, she lived in a cavernous home where silence became oppressive. Neighbors visited less frequently. Family, wary of her growing reputation, kept their distance. This solitude seemed to unmoor her. Some evenings she could be seen walking the veranda for hours, muttering to herself, candlelight flickering across her pale face. Letters describe her voice carrying across fields at midnight, low and rhythmic, sometimes weeping, sometimes chanting. To some, these were the cries of a lonely woman unraveling. To others, they were evidence that she had entered into communion with something unspeakable. The psychological toll of power cannot be overlooked either. She controlled land, lives, and wealth in a society that rarely allowed women such autonomy. The pressure to maintain her estate may have twisted her grief into severity, her loneliness into paranoia. Power can isolate as much as it protects, and in her isolation, she may have found herself bending faith into something unrecognizable, blending prayer with command, seeking not comfort, but control. Rumors of cruelty grew alongside these behaviors. Some said she kept a hidden chamber in her home, a room lined with books not of scripture but of forbidden knowledge, books filled with diagrams and symbols that no one could translate. Others swore they heard the sound of chains clattering from within the house at night, though no prisoner was ever seen. One particularly persistent story claimed she had locked herself in a parlor for 3 days, emerging with eyes red as fire and voice hoarse, declaring only, "He is listening now." Who he was remained unspoken, but the ambiguity was more chilling than any named entity could be. And yet, for all these accounts, There remained the image of her as a woman to be pitied. Visitors noted her gaunt figure, the way her dresses hung looser each year, the deepening lines across her face. Her health seemed to deteriorate under the weight of her own contradictions. Physicians described her as prone to fainting, her hands trembling during meals. Was this the toll of guilt, the collapse of a body burdened by secrets, or simply the natural decline of a woman aging under extraordinary pressure? This duality, victim and villain, saint and sorceress, became the defining enigma of her existence. The more one tries to untangle her reputation, the tighter the knot becomes. If she was merely grieving, why did her rituals inspire terror? If she was manipulative and cruel, why did her devotion to faith appear so genuine to outsiders? Perhaps the truth lay in both, an unsettling blend that blurred the boundaries between coping and cruelty, faith and fear. The legacy of her life was not written in ledgers or sermons, but in the stories whispered long after. Children in the surrounding towns were warned not to wander near the plantation after dark, lest they hear the widow's prayers on the wind. Adults debated her morality, some defending her as a woman unfairly maligned, others condemning her as proof that evil can wear lace and pearls as easily as horns. Her existence became less about fact than about the space between fact and fear. By the time her final night arrived, the woman who had once embodied both grace and menace had become inseparable from the legends she inspired. Her life had dissolved into rumor so thoroughly that truth was no longer distinguishable from superstition. Whether she was a victim of isolation, a manipulator who thrived on fear, or something caught between both extremes, her story was already preparing itself for the darkness of midnight. The candle that burned in her chamber on the night of her death was not merely an object of light. It was the last witness to a life that defied explanation. To some, her rituals had been prayers of desperation, fragile attempts to reach a God who seemed silent. To others, they were proof of her descent into forces no faith could redeem. Either way, the line between innocence and evil had long since blurred, and by the time the widow's eyes stared open into the darkness of that Mississippi night, she had already become less a woman than a mystery, an enigma shaped by grief, power, and whispers that refused to die. Midnight in Mississippi, 1824. The house stood silent under a swollen moon, its shutters drawn tight against the thick air, its halls echoing with the memory of prayers whispered and secrets never confessed. Within those walls, the widow had lived her final hours. The official papers would later say she passed peacefully in her bed, but nothing about her death ever felt peaceful. It clung to the plantation like smoke after a fire, lingering in whispers, in testimony, in the way people swore that even years later, the chamber never felt quite empty. The story of that night has been told and retold, folded into sermons, warnings, gossip, and ghost tales by firelight. Yet every retelling bends with the weight of its teller. Some describe a woman ravaged by sickness, her body finally giving way. Others claim she died screaming, her soul seized by something not of this world. The truth is buried somewhere between, layered in contradictions, official lines of ink, and the trembling voices of those who swore they saw more than a simple death. The timeline begins with silence. Shortly after dusk, she had dismissed her attendants, insisting she needed solitude for her evening devotions. To the clergy, this was proof of her piety. To the workers who served her, it was something else entirely. They spoke of strange chants echoing faintly through the shutters, not the soothing cadences of prayer but guttural sounds that rolled like curses across the floorboards. They claimed she lit candles not in devotion but in patterns, symbols no one could quite understand. Some said she wept, others said she laughed. None dared enter. By midnight, the house had stilled. It was then that testimonies diverged into shadows. A field hand later confessed he saw a figure approach the main house. He described it as tall, impossibly thin and blacker than the night itself. It moved with a slow certainty, slipping through the door without sound, though no one remembered it being opened. The man who told this was mocked, accused of superstition, but his voice never wavered. He insisted he saw it pass. Another worker spoke of a sound, one sharp bell tolling once just before the hour. The detail seems small, almost trivial, until one remembers there was no bell on the property. No tower, no hanging iron, nothing to explain why that sound would echo over the fields. Neighbors a mile away, however, swore they too heard it. A single mournful ring, out of place and out of time. Inside the house, a neighbor who had stayed late in conversation with one of the servants described hearing something else entirely. A scream. Not long, not loud, but sharp enough to make the hairs rise on his arms. He asked if anyone had cried out, but no one answered. The next morning, when word spread that the widow had died, he knew what he had heard. The official account, written in neat script by a local physician, stated the cause as apoplexy, a sudden stroke of the brain, the kind that takes life swiftly, leaving little time for struggle. His notes were methodical but curiously brief. The body had been found in bed, eyes open, lips parted. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence of poisoning, no wound upon her body. And yet those who stood near her swore her expression was not one of peace but of shock, as though her last breath had been stolen, not surrendered. It is here that rational explanation collides with folklore. Was it a stroke, a quiet end to a life marked by loneliness and strain? Or was it something darker, something that came for her when the hour was at its thinnest, when shadows stretch and silence deepens? The midnight visitor became the name locals gave to that shadowy presence. No one agreed on what it was. Some said it was death itself, come to collect a soul too steeped in grief and cruelty to go gently. Others whispered it was the ghost of her husband, returned to chastise her for sins unspoken. A few dared to suggest it was something summoned, that the rituals she performed in the long hours of night had finally opened a door she could not close. Her chamber became a place of uneasy fascination. Visitors reported cold drafts, though no windows stood open. Candles sputtered out without cause. One servant refused to enter at all, claiming she felt watched, as though the widow's eyes still lingered. When pressed, she described hearing a faint tolling sound when she stood near the threshold, like the memory of a bell that had never been built. Historians examining letters from the time noted how neighbors struggled to explain their unease. One wrote of hearing cries across the fields, carried on the wind though no one was near. Another wrote that her dogs had howled the entire night, refusing to be calmed until dawn broke. To these accounts, skeptics pointed out the unreliability of frightened minds. But the consistency of the details, the bell, the cry, the figure, troubled even the most rational. The psychology of grief complicates the picture further. In the years after her husband's death, she lived in an isolation that seemed to consume her. Friends described her as increasingly erratic, withdrawn, prone to sudden bursts of temper or tears. She sought counsel from clergy who praised her devotion, but others whispered of strange books delivered discreetly, of herbs burned in odd combinations. Loneliness can drive the mind into deep corners, crafting rituals to fill the void. Yet the line between coping and conjuring, between habit and obsession, is thin. The night she died may have been the culmination of that descent. If she had indeed been dabbling in strange practices, was her end a mere collapse of body under strain? Or did her practices open her to fears that took root and grew into reality? In storytelling, perception is often stronger than fact. To those who feared her, her death was confirmation, the wages of cruelty collected. To those who pitied her, it was tragedy, a woman undone by sorrow and isolation. Even today, her story resists neat resolution. Skeptics point to medical explanations. A sudden stroke, perhaps worsened by sleepless nights and nervous strain. Some argue poisoning, accidental or deliberate, though no record proves it. Others, fascinated by the consistency of the folklore, argue that something beyond medicine entered her chamber that night. They point to the testimonies, the letters, the persistent imagery of the shadow figure and the single toll of a bell. The narrative lingers because it refuses to end. Each telling reopens the room, lets us step once more into that midnight hour. The widow lies in bed, her lips parted, her eyes open as though about to speak. Outside, the moss sways gently in the moonlight, the air heavy and still. Somewhere across the fields, a dog howls. And then, just at the moment when silence grows unbearable, a single sound cuts through the night. Not a scream, not a prayer, a bell deep and final. And once more we are forced to ask, what really entered her room? Morning came heavy over the fields, the sky tinged with the muted gray of storm clouds not yet broken. The widow's body lay cold in her chamber, her eyes fixed in that unrelenting stare, lips still parted as if she had died in the middle of a word no one would ever hear. The house, usually alive with the shuffle of servants, had fallen into silence. Only the creak of the floorboards and the distant caw of crows broke the stillness. Word of her death spread quickly, carried down dirt roads, whispered in the markets and retold at the steps of the church. The first explanations came swiftly. A local physician, summoned at dawn, declared her death the result of exhaustion of the heart. He spoke with the detached precision of a man used to finality, his words intended to quiet speculation before it could take root. In his report he noted no visible wounds, no evidence of poisoning, nothing that might hint at foul play. The diagnosis was vague, almost evasive, an umbrella term that explained everything and nothing at once. The clergy, however, offered a different story. Standing before a congregation still buzzing with fear, a preacher declared her passing a punishment for unrepented sins. He painted her death as a moral lesson, a divine strike against pride, cruelty, and secret wickedness. His words ignited murmurs, for many in the pews had long harbored doubts about the widow's practices, her midnight devotions, her whispered chants, the flickering lights seen through her window at ungodly hours. To them, the preacher's warning confirmed what they had always suspected, that the widow had invited darkness into her home, and God himself had seen fit to end it. Yet even as official accounts and sermons were delivered, another version of the story spread far more quickly, weaving itself into the fabric of Mississippi's folklore. Around firesides and in the corners of taverns, people retold the night of her death not as a medical misfortune, nor as a moral punishment, but as a haunting. The tale grew wings, carried by fear and fascination. Children dared each other to whisper about the midnight visitor, while elders used the story as a warning. Beware the land, for curses cling to it like vines to stone. In these retellings, details shifted and stretched. The shadow that slipped into her room became a phantom cloaked in smoke. The sound of the bell, a single toll in the night, became the harbinger of death, said to echo only for those marked by fate. Some swore her ghost still wandered the plantation grounds, her lips forever parted, her voice forever trapped in silence. The line between history and legend blurred, and once blurred, it could never be cleanly redrawn. This clash of narratives, science, religion, and superstition, created a strange tension. Rational voices pointed to the doctor's explanation, yet his diagnosis felt hollow, unsatisfying. The preacher thundered about sin and judgment, but his certainty seemed more like theater than truth. And then there were the eyewitness accounts, the ones that refused to fade. Workers who had seen the figure, neighbors who had heard the screams, families who could not dismiss the tolling of a bell that did not exist. The more people tried to explain the night away, the more those stubborn details clawed their way back into the story, refusing to be silenced. Modern psychologists have since revisited her life through the lens of trauma. They describe a woman consumed by grief after the loss of her husband, isolated within the suffocating walls of her estate. Her erratic behavior, her sudden tempers, her obsessive rituals, could be read as symptoms of untreated depression, perhaps even psychosis. In this view, the widow was less villain than victim, undone not by curses but by the crushing weight of loneliness and power. Her death, sudden and unexplained, could have been the final collapse of a body worn thin by years of emotional strain. Historians, meanwhile, look not only at the woman herself but at the world she inhabited. They note how stories of curses and hauntings often served as convenient veils, masking the brutal realities of life on plantations. By framing her death as supernatural, the community could avoid grappling with harsher truths. The cruelty of her household, the whispered tales of punishment behind locked doors, the voices of enslaved people who described her as a figure of dread. Folklore allowed the living to rewrite the narrative, turning a messy, complicated death into a morality tale, one that placed the blame not on systemic injustice, but on the victim herself. And yet, no matter how logical or analytical these interpretations appear, the eyewitness accounts remain disturbingly resistant. The man who saw the shadow entering her home never wavered in his testimony. He insisted until his own death that he had seen it with his own eyes, a figure darker than night, slipping silently where no door opened. The neighbors who heard the cries never recanted. The families who spoke of the phantom bell described it with chilling consistency, down to the way its sound carried across the fields like thunder rolling without a storm. Such testimony forces a question. Why invent a detail so peculiar, so easily disproved? If it had been just one person, their story could be dismissed as imagination. But when several voices echo the same impossible sound, the dismissal becomes harder. The bell that did not exist becomes the most haunting detail of all. Over the decades, the widow's death hardened into legend. Travelers wrote of it in diaries, missionaries whispered it in sermons, and folklorists scribbled notes about the cursed plantation where a woman had died with her eyes open and her lips frozen mid-breath. Each retelling added a new layer, a new shade of fear. Some said the land itself had turned sour, that crops failed in soil touched by her grave. Others claimed her ghost appeared only to women, her figure a warning of what happens when grief is left to fester into madness. Science versus superstition, fact versus folklore, psychology versus ghost story. The widow's death became a mirror, reflecting back whatever the teller feared most. For the clergy, it was sin. For the physician, it was the frailty of flesh. For the workers, it was proof that shadows walk among the living. For modern minds, it is trauma, unacknowledged and untreated. Each perspective carries weight, and yet none silences the others. The contradictions are the story. Perhaps that is why her tale endures. Because beneath the facts, beneath the folklore, lies something universal. The fear of what waits in the dark. The fear that death does not come quietly, that it comes with signs and shadows, bells and cries, that it leaves behind questions we cannot answer. Her story reminds us that even the most rational explanations can sit uneasily beside the memory of what people swore they saw, heard, and felt. The widow was buried quickly, her coffin lowered into earth said to resist the spade. The preacher declared the ground consecrated, though some whispered it rejected her body. For weeks after, workers refused to enter her chamber, claiming the air inside was thick, unbreathable. Visitors described a weight pressing on their chest, a sense of being observed. The plantation never fully shed the stain of that night. Families left, crops failed, and the house itself eventually fell into ruin. Yet the legend lived on. In Mississippi's folklore, the widow became both warning and specter, a symbol of the thin line between faith and fear, isolation and obsession, science and superstition. Her death was not merely an end, but a beginning. The birth of a story that continues to be told, a mystery that grows darker each time it is spoken aloud. And so the question lingers, as it always does. Was she a woman undone by grief and cruelty, a mortal heart that simply gave out under too much strain? Or did something step into her chamber that night, something no diagnosis, no sermon, no historian can fully explain? The shadow, the bell, the scream, these fragments remain, stubborn and unresolved, echoing across centuries. The midnight visitor has no face, no name, no proof, only stories. And sometimes stories are the most terrifying evidence of all. The grave was supposed to bring peace. Buried beneath the gnarled oak trees, the widow was laid into Mississippi soil with hurried prayers and the hollow clang of shovels striking dirt. Yet peace never came. For those who remained on the plantation, her absence did not end the story. It deepened it. Where her body had been lowered, fear seemed to rise, creeping into every shadow, whispering through every silence. The first to speak of her return was a girl no more than 12, the daughter of a field hand. In hushed tones, she told how she had seen a figure pacing the edges of the burial ground. It was dusk, she said, and the world glowed in the half-light of the fading sun. The shape was unmistakable, tall, draped in dark folds, moving with a slow, deliberate rhythm as though counting steps. The girl swore she saw the widow's face turn toward her, eyes wide, lips parted, frozen in that same haunting expression she had worn in death. Terrified, she ran, but the vision did not fade. For weeks afterward, she refused to go near the trees, insisting the shadow remained, waiting, walking. Her story spread quickly. To some, it was the overactive imagination of a frightened child. To others, it was confirmation of what they already believed. The widow was not at rest. Fear began to twist ordinary events into omens. When the wind whistled through cracks in the shutters, it was her sigh. When the dogs barked at empty air, it was her passing shadow. A house already heavy with grief grew heavier still, and soon no corner felt safe. One account, preserved in the pages of an old preacher's journal, describes a Sunday morning unlike any other. Mid-sermon, as he addressed his flock, the preacher claimed his voice was overpowered by another, low, rasping, and feminine. The congregation fell silent, all eyes wide as the sound rippled through the chapel. Some swore it was the widow's voice calling from beyond the grave. The preacher wrote that he felt a hand on his shoulder, though no one stood behind him. His words faltered, and in their place came a whisper that only some claimed to understand. "I am not finished." For weeks afterward, attendance dwindled. Faith itself seemed shaken by the possibility that death had not silenced her. Even her surviving relatives were not spared. Her niece, who inherited what remained of the estate, wrote to a cousin that life on the plantation had grown unbearable. The soil, once rich and fertile, yielded little. Cotton withered, corn stalks collapsed, and animals disappeared without explanation. Horses bolted in the night as if pursued. Chickens were found lifeless without a single wound, and dogs whimpered endlessly at the foot of the widow's locked chamber. Workers fled, some in the dead of night, refusing even their wages if it meant escape. They spoke of footsteps in the halls, doors slamming though no wind blew, and the soft sound of weeping drifting down from the bedroom where she had died. Was it grief that made them hear such things? Or did the widow truly walk among them still? Psychologists might argue that trauma has a way of replaying itself, echoing in the minds of those who cannot reconcile the horror they witnessed. To the enslaved workers and family alike, the widow had been both master and mystery, a figure of power, fear, and contradiction. Her sudden death, coupled with the strange details of that night, may have left scars that no burial could cover. In such an atmosphere, even the smallest creak of wood could become a phantom's footstep, and every flicker of shadow could grow into a specter. But there are details harder to dismiss. On more than one occasion, neighbors swore they saw lantern light flickering in the windows of the abandoned house. When they approached, the air inside was cold, unnaturally so, and the faint scent of smoke lingered though no fire burned. A schoolteacher who boarded nearby described hearing a bell toll at midnight, just once, as though announcing a death that had already happened. When he investigated, there was no tower, no rope, nothing that could explain the sound. Folklore absorbed these testimonies, weaving them into a tapestry of terror. The widow became a story told to children as a warning. Do not wander after dark. Do not linger near the oaks. Do not tempt the spirit who could not find rest. Some called her a curse upon the land, others a restless soul crying for justice. Her name faded, replaced by titles whispered with reverence and fear: the Lady of Midnight, the Mourning Widow, the Shadow Bride. Religion clashed with fear. Clergy urged the people to see her death as divine retribution. Yet how could they ignore the voices of their own parishioners? If her soul was condemned, why did it not stay buried? Some whispered that the devil himself walked the grounds, wearing her face as disguise. Others believed she lingered not from evil but from torment, her grief so powerful that even death could not sever her from the world she once ruled. The plantation stood as a monument to this debate. Historians note that such legends often served practical purposes. Fear of curses kept trespassers away, preserved property lines, and allowed families to explain away misfortune without confronting uncomfortable truths. Crops fail? It was the widow's curse, not poor soil management. Workers vanish? They were frightened by ghosts, not fleeing oppression. In this way, folklore acted as both shield and smokescreen, concealing human cruelty behind supernatural dread. Yet dismissing every testimony as convenience or superstition feels too simple. The preacher's journal still exists, its ink faded but legible. The girl's account, passed through generations, retains a startling consistency. Even the niece's letters, preserved in archives, speak of a fear so tangible it shaped decisions, fortunes, and lives. These documents may be tinged with exaggeration, but they are undeniably real, and their sincerity refuses to be ignored. To this day, descendants of those who lived on the land tell stories of strange happenings. Hunters claim to see a woman in the distance, standing still among the trees, her figure vanishing when approached. Locals speak of nights when the air grows heavy, when silence presses down so completely it feels like drowning, and in that silence comes the faint rustle of skirts dragging across the floorboards of a house long since reduced to ruins. Travelers who camp nearby report dreams of a woman's face hovering above them, her eyes open, lips trembling as if caught forever between words. Is this trauma echoing through time, passed from one fearful generation to the next? Or is it something more, a restless presence tethered to a place it cannot leave? Psychology argues that memory and fear can outlive bodies, creating ghosts in the mind if not in the world. Religion contends that spirits exist, punished or unfulfilled, wandering until their burden is lifted. Folklore insists the story itself is proof, for what is retold for centuries must carry a truth greater than fact. The widow's shadow refuses to fade. Whether born of guilt, grief, or something unearthly, it lingers on the edges of Mississippi's history. Her story is told not as a closed chapter, but as an open wound, a question without an answer. Each testimony, each legend, becomes another piece of evidence, fragile yet persistent, daring us to choose between reason and fear. And perhaps that is the real curse. Not the shadow at the window, not the voice in the chapel, not the bell at midnight, but the uncertainty itself. For in uncertainty lies terror, and in terror lies the power of stories that refuse to die. The death of the widow on the Mississippi plantation did not end with her burial. If anything, it began there. What should have been a closing chapter, sealed by the earth, sanctified by prayer, fractured instead into countless versions, each carrying its own conviction, each rooted in memory, fear, ambition, or imagination. Her story, already tangled with contradictions during her life, became even more contested in death. And so theories grew like vines across the ruins of her house, twisting around truth until no one could say where fact ended and legend began. Among the most widely circulated explanations was that of poisoning. Inheritance disputes were common in antebellum Mississippi, and plantations were often arenas of quiet wars within families. The widow, by surviving her husband and taking sole control, became both powerful and vulnerable. Relatives who had expected to share in wealth now found themselves excluded. Some speculated that resentment fermented into conspiracy, that the widow's meals were not as carefully guarded as her reputation suggested. A single bitter almond taste, a faint discoloration in her teacup might have been enough to end her. Cyanide was known in the 19th century, though not commonly discussed in polite society, and arsenic, inheritance powder, as it was sometimes called, was disturbingly easy to obtain. Letters from a cousin preserved in fragments even hint at jealousy over land divisions, though no direct confession survives. To those who believed in poisoning, the midnight visitor was merely the frightened mind's way of dressing human treachery in supernatural costume. Yet others dismissed the idea entirely. They argued her death bore the unmistakable signs of natural decline. She had been prone to fainting spells, had grown thin from grief, and her servants noted a persistent cough that worsened with the dampness of summer nights. One physician, though his credentials remained debated, wrote that she succumbed to what he termed exhaustion of the heart, an umbrella diagnosis often applied when medicine could not explain sudden collapses. A stroke, an aneurysm, or a concealed infection could all have taken her swiftly in the night. Advocates of this natural theory point out that sudden deaths were common in the 19th century, when medical knowledge was still bound by guesswork and superstition. For them, the shadow glimpsed by witnesses was nothing more than coincidence, a trick of moonlight on curtains, a silhouette formed by trees swaying against her window, magnified by the imagination of those already fearful of her eccentric ways. And yet, try as rationalists might, the supernatural theory endured. Workers whispered of the midnight visitor, a figure tall, formless, and deliberate in its movements, seen entering her chamber on the very night she died. No intruder was found, no footprints left behind, but the testimonies carried the weight of collective conviction. The folklore was so persistent that even outsiders visiting the region decades later heard mention of the entity. Some swore it was an omen, a harbinger that had come to claim her soul at the appointed hour. Others believed it to be the restless spirit of her husband, returning not in love but in judgment, punishing her for sins whispered about, but never named aloud. The chilling detail of a bell ringing, a bell that did not exist, only strengthened the legend. How, people asked, could so many unrelated accounts describe the same sound if it had not truly rung? Debate over these theories became more than idle speculation. They reflected deeper struggles in the human need to explain death itself. Poison suggested betrayal, reminding communities of how greed corrodes kinship. Natural causes offered reassurance, grounding her death in the familiar cycle of frailty and disease. The supernatural theory, however, transcended explanation. It turned the widow's passing into a parable, a haunting that resisted closure, a story capable of transmitting fear across generations. Each possibility said less about what truly happened and more about what people feared might happen to them. To explore the poisoning theory further, one must return to the social structure of the plantation. Wealth was not only tied to land but to reputation. The widow's survival, her capacity to manage property after her husband's death, was itself remarkable in a world that rarely entrusted women with authority. Such independence inevitably provoked hostility. Rumors circulated that distant relatives considered her unfit, a coded term suggesting both gender bias and resentment. If indeed she was poisoned, her death reveals less about personal animosity than about broader cultural pressures that sought to return power into male hands. Some modern historians even argue that the persistence of the supernatural theory was a convenient distraction. By framing her death as the work of a ghostly visitor, the community could avoid confronting the uglier truth of domestic betrayal. The natural death explanation, though less sensational, also carries interpretive weight. Her frailty and isolation made her vulnerable to both physical and mental decline. Scholars of 19th century medicine point out that what physicians termed hysterical weakness, or exhaustion, was often the cumulative effect of depression, malnutrition, and untreated illnesses. If she did die naturally, then the ghost stories surrounding her reveal not supernatural forces, but the community's inability to face the mundane reality of grief. Death without cause is terrifying in its ordinariness. By cloaking it in mystery, people found both entertainment and moral instruction. To say she was taken by a visitor made her passing meaningful, even if inaccurately so. Still, the supernatural refuses to be dismissed. Consider the testimonies: workers who risked punishment by speaking out, neighbors who swore they heard screams carried on the wind, the peculiar absence of animals near her chamber that night. Skeptics argue these accounts stem from suggestion and fear, but folklore scholars counter that the consistency across testimonies, spanning class, race, and geography, demands attention. Was it mass hysteria, or does it indicate some unexplained phenomenon? Even modern psychologists analyzing the case suggest the possibility of a collective hallucination, in which stress and trauma synchronize the perceptions of multiple witnesses. Others remain open to more esoteric explanations, unwilling to reduce centuries of testimony to mere illusion. As the years passed, each theory took on a life of its own. Local storytellers embellished the poisoning theory into tales of greedy heirs who met their own untimely ends, as if cursed by their crime. The natural death account was reshaped into moralistic lessons about health and divine will, and the supernatural story, most enduring of all, became campfire lore. The widow's spirit, forever pacing the plantation, waiting for the midnight visitor to return again. Tourists who traveled through Mississippi in the early 20th century were told of the cursed land, where crops failed and shadows lengthened too quickly at dusk. In this way, her death transcended fact, becoming folklore that shaped the identity of the region itself. But what do these theories ultimately reveal? They reveal the boundaries of human understanding. Poison points to human cruelty, natural causes point to human fragility, the supernatural points to human imagination, and perhaps to forces beyond imagination. Each theory alone feels insufficient. Together, they form a kaleidoscope of explanations that both illuminate and obscure the truth. And perhaps that is the final lesson. That some deaths resist resolution, not because evidence is lacking, but because resolution itself is a comfort the community cannot afford. In the end, the widow's death became less about her and more about those who remembered her. Her body was gone, but her story remained malleable clay in the hands of descendants, historians, ministers, and storytellers. Poisoning told of greed, natural decline told of fragility, the supernatural told of fear and wonder. Each listener, depending on temperament, chose the theory that resonated most. Believers in rationalism dismissed the ghost, but trembled at the possibility of betrayal. Believers in faith rejected medical explanations but accepted that spirits intervene when sins remain unpunished. And those caught between found themselves haunted not by the visitor, but by the unending question. What really happened that night? The lack of resolution ensures the widow's story remains alive. Folklore thrives not on certainty but on doubt. If she was poisoned, the culprit was never caught. If she died naturally, her symptoms were never properly documented. If she was taken by a visitor, the entity never appeared again. Each gap fuels imagination, making her death a mirror for human anxieties. Was it greed, frailty, or something unworldly? Every retelling gives a different answer, and in each the widow lives again, not as a woman but as a legend. Even now, scholars continue to debate. Folklorists trace the midnight visitor to older African and European tales of shadowy collectors of souls, suggesting the story fused cultural traditions. Psychologists read it as an allegory of trauma, the plantation itself haunted by centuries of injustice. Historians focus on the politics of inheritance and the silencing of women, yet none can provide the final word. The widow defies closure, her story expanding into the very shape of mystery itself. In this way, she achieves a strange immortality, not through memory of her virtues but through the endless questions her death inspired. And perhaps this is why the supernatural theory persists most powerfully. Poison and natural death explain her end, but do not explain why we continue to talk about her. The midnight visitor does. It transforms her death from a personal tragedy into a collective riddle, from a historical event into a myth. Whether or not the visitor was real matters less than the fact that people believed it was. Belief, after all, can be more enduring than truth. Thus, the widow's death remains unresolved, not by accident but by design. Theories abound, yet none hold the final key. She is forever caught between nature and nurture, reason and myth, truth and belief. To hear her story is to stand at the edge of certainty and feel it dissolve into mist. And when the night is quiet and the air carries a chill, one might almost hear it again. The faint toll of a bell that never existed, summoning us not to answers, but to wonder. The story of the Mississippi widow draws to a close not with answers, but with echoes. We return, as we must, to that midnight room where she lay alone, curtains swaying, the air heavy with the weight of everything unsaid. Some claim her eyes were wide, frozen in terror at what she saw. Others whisper they were closed, softened by the calm of release. The official records end there, declaring only that death came swiftly, yet the whispers never stopped. Was she a cruel mistress punished by rumor and transformed into a ghostly parable? Or was she a lonely woman broken by grief, whose every action was misread by those who never truly knew her? Generations have debated these questions, each version shaped as much by the fears of the teller as by the fragments of fact left behind. Science assures us it was coincidence, a sudden collapse of the heart, a misfiring of human perception in the gloom of night. Folklore insists it was justice, that the land itself demanded retribution, and the midnight visitor came as executioner. Faith, stern and unyielding, calls it damnation, a soul unrepentant, claimed in its hour of weakness. Each interpretation feels both convincing and incomplete, like shadows on the wall that change depending on where the candle is placed. Perhaps the truth died with her, buried beneath the soil of the plantation along with the weight of her secrets. Or perhaps the truth still lingers, hidden in the silence of Mississippi's midnight fields, waiting for another restless soul to pass by and listen closely. For in the end, what is a haunting if not memory refusing to fade? The widow's story is not a puzzle to be solved but a mirror held up to us. It reflects greed, grief, cruelty, imagination, and our unrelenting hunger to explain what terrifies us. Was it poison? Was it sickness? Was it something no mortal mind can grasp? Every answer is an escape, and every escape leaves behind one lingering question. And so as the curtain falls on this tale, we are left with more than a mystery. We are left with an invitation, a whisper that drifts like wind across the fields where she once walked, asking us to decide. For some, it will always be the comfort of science. For others, the certainty of folklore. For others still, the stern verdict of faith. But when the night is quiet, when the fields fall still and the shadows seem longer than they should be, the choice no longer feels simple. Perhaps you will hear it too. A bell tolling where no bell stands, a voice calling from nowhere, a presence passing silently through a closed door. What do you believe?